"You don't owe me explanations for your social life," she said, and I realized she was absolutely right. The confrontation started when Whitney walked through our downtown Denver loft apartment door at 2:17 a.m. wearing a black sequin dress I'd never seen before and heels that cost more than my monthly gym membership. I'd been awake, not waiting up exactly, but unable to sleep knowing she was supposedly at a quick team dinner that had somehow stretched past midnight. The marketing firm where she worked as a junior account coordinator rarely kept anyone past 6, and their idea of team bonding usually involved coffee shop meetings and the occasional happy hour at that sports bar near their office building where they served overpriced appetizers and watered-down cocktails. This wasn't that kind of evening, and we both knew it from the moment she walked through the door with that carefully calculated expression of someone preparing for battle. I asked her about the dinner, keeping my voice neutral, curious rather than accusatory, the way I might ask about any normal part of her day. She immediately went defensive, her shoulders tensing as she explained how the team had decided to continue their celebration at some upscale rooftop bar downtown after landing a major client for their digital marketing portfolio. The story might have been believable if she hadn't mentioned meeting colleagues there, using air quotes around the word colleagues like it was some kind of inside joke I wasn't privy to understanding. Her phone had been buzzing constantly throughout her explanation, notifications lighting up the screen every few seconds with incoming messages, but she kept it face down on the kitchen counter like those messages contained state secrets or nuclear launch codes. When I asked which colleagues specifically, since I knew most of her coworkers from company events and holiday parties and none of them seemed like the exclusive rooftop bar type, her entire demeanor shifted from defensive to openly hostile in a way that felt like watching someone flip a switch. She informed me that she was a grown woman who didn't need to provide detailed itineraries for her social activities, her voice taking on that sharp edge I'd heard more frequently over the past few months whenever I asked basic questions about her day or her plans. I wasn't asking for an itinerary, I pointed out reasonably, just trying to understand why a quick team dinner had turned into an all-night club experience with people she'd never mentioned before in 3 years of complaining about her coworkers and their boring office politics. That's when she completely exploded, telling me this wasn't some kind of parole agreement where she had to check in and report her whereabouts to her probation officer every few hours. She didn't owe me explanations for where she went, who she saw, or what she did with her free time, because apparently basic relationship communication was now a violation of her constitutional rights. Her voice got louder with each word, building to a crescendo of righteous indignation that seemed completely disproportionate to my simple questions about her evening and why she'd come home looking like she'd been dancing in a nightclub rather than eating appetizers with her boring marketing colleagues. I stood there watching this woman I'd shared a bed with for 3 years, someone I'd been considering proposing to within the next year, someone whose morning coffee preferences I knew better than my own, transform into someone I didn't recognize, someone who treated basic relationship communication like an unreasonable demand for surveillance and control over her every movement. She wasn't done yet, though. She launched into a passionate speech about independence and personal freedom, about how just because we lived together and split bills and shared a life didn't mean she'd signed away her fundamental right to exist as an individual human being. She accused me of trying to control her social life, of being jealous of her success at work, of resenting the fact that she was building a career and networking with important people in her industry who might actually help her advance professionally, unlike her current dead-end position. The accusations kept coming, each one more ridiculous and disconnected from reality than the last, until I realized she was essentially arguing against the concept of accountability itself in romantic relationships. According to Whitney's passionate worldview, asking your long-term partner about their evening was controlling and manipulative behavior. Wanting to understand why they disappeared until dawn without any explanation was jealousy and possessiveness of the worst kind. Expecting basic communication about plans and sudden changes was treating them like property rather than respecting them as an autonomous individual with their own agency and decision-making capabilities. She stood there in that expensive dress I'd never seen hanging in her side of our shared closet, makeup smeared from whatever activities had kept her out all night, lecturing me about the fundamental principles of adult relationships while demonstrating the emotional maturity of someone who'd never learned that partnership involves consideration for another person's feelings and basic respect for shared commitments and mutual trust. The whole performance was so absolutely absurd it actually clarified everything for me in a way months of growing tension and unexplained behavior changes and mysterious late nights couldn't. She was right about one thing: she didn't owe me explanations for her choices and her behavior. But I was finally understanding that she didn't want to give them either, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities, her character, and her vision of what our 3-year relationship actually meant to her in the grand scheme of her personal development. When she finished her rant about independence and personal freedom and stormed toward the bedroom, probably expecting me to follow like a desperate puppy and either apologize for my unreasonable expectations or escalate the fight into something more dramatic where she could paint me as the controlling boyfriend, I felt this moment of crystalline clarity wash over me like cold water hitting my face on a winter morning. I looked at this woman who thought basic relationship communication was oppression, who treated my completely reasonable questions like personal attacks on her character, and realized I was wasting my time and energy trying to build something meaningful and lasting with someone who fundamentally rejected the concept of partnership itself. Instead of following her or continuing the argument or trying to salvage something that was already dead and decomposing, I stayed exactly where I was standing in our kitchen and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Perfect," I told her calmly, my voice steady and final as a closing door. "Then neither do I." Whitney stormed off to the bedroom and slammed the door, probably expecting me to follow and continue the argument, but I had something entirely different in mind. While she was presumably calling someone to complain about my unreasonable behavior, I was systematically dismantling 3 years of shared life with the methodical precision I normally reserved for renewable energy project assessments. I started with the practical things first, pulling out my laptop and opening our shared financial accounts to understand exactly what needed to be separated. Our joint savings account held about $8,000, mostly my contributions since Whitney's idea of saving involved buying things on sale instead of things she actually needed. I transferred my portion electronically, watching the numbers shift on the screen with the same detached focus I'd used to analyze solar panel efficiency reports for clients who actually valued long-term planning over immediate gratification. The kitchen was next, and I packed my coffee maker, the good knives I'd brought from my previous apartment, and the cast iron skillet my grandmother had given me when I graduated college. Whitney had always complained that cast iron was too much work to maintain properly, preferring non-stick pans that needed replacing every 18 months, but I'd kept it anyway because some things are worth the extra effort when they're built to last, unlike relationships with people who prioritize convenience over commitment. Around 4 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter where she'd left it during her dramatic exit, and the notification preview lit up the screen before I could look away. The message was from someone named dev_nightlife_king. And the preview text was explicit enough to confirm everything I'd suspected about her evening activities and then some. There were several more messages in the thread, including photos that made it clear this wasn't their first conversation and definitely wasn't related to her marketing career unless Denver nightclub promotion had suddenly become part of her professional responsibilities. I didn't open the phone or scroll through their conversation history because I didn't need to see more evidence of what was already obvious. But seeing those messages crystallized my decision to leave completely rather than try to salvage something that had been dying for months while I'd been too focused on work deadlines and project timelines to recognize the signs. By the time the sun started rising over the Denver skyline, casting long shadows across our loft that would soon belong only to Whitney, I'd called my friend Carlos, who owned a moving truck for his landscaping business, and arranged to borrow it for the morning. Carlos had been through his own messy breakup 2 years earlier and understood the importance of swift, decisive action when a relationship imploded, especially when staying longer would only create more opportunities for drama and manipulation. He arrived at 7 with coffee and breakfast burritos from our favorite Mexican place, ready to help me load everything that mattered into his truck without asking unnecessary questions about what had finally pushed me over the edge or whether I was making a mistake by leaving so quickly. We worked efficiently, carrying boxes and furniture down 3 flights of stairs while Whitney remained locked in the bedroom, either asleep or pretending to be asleep to avoid dealing with the reality of what was happening outside her door. I packed my books, my tools, my winter gear, and the framed photographs of my family that had decorated our living room walls, making the space look more like a home than the sterile apartment it was returning to. The apartment looked noticeably emptier with each trip to the truck, but also somehow more honest, like removing my presence revealed what it had actually been all along instead of what I'd thought we were building together through shared meals and weekend plans and conversations about the future. The hardest part was deciding what to do about the furniture we'd bought together, the couch we'd spent weeks researching, and the dining table where we'd hosted dinner parties for friends who probably knew about her affair before I did and had been too uncomfortable to say anything. I decided to leave most of it behind because starting over completely seemed cleaner than trying to divide assets from a relationship that had been fundamentally dishonest, and because everything we'd chosen together now carried the taint of her deception. Carlos helped me load my desk, my computer setup, and the vintage leather chair I'd inherited from my grandfather, the things that were unmistakably mine and carried memories that existed before Whitney entered my life and complicated everything with her version of partnership that apparently involved parallel lives rather than shared ones. Around 9:30, I wrote a note and left it propped against the coffee maker she'd never learned to use properly despite 3 years of watching me make coffee every morning, a small detail that now seemed like a metaphor for her general unwillingness to invest effort in things that mattered to our relationship. The note was simple and direct, just like my decision to leave had been. I wrote that I was out for good and that no explanation was needed, echoing her own philosophy about not owing anyone justification for personal choices. I included my portion of the rent for the final month on our lease and my set of keys, ensuring she couldn't later claim I'd left her financially stranded or stolen property that belonged to both of us, even though she'd essentially stolen 3 years of my life by pretending to be someone she wasn't. By 10:15, Carlos and I were driving through downtown Denver toward a storage facility I'd found online that offered 24-hour access and month-to-month contracts, the kind of practical solution that Whitney would have dismissed as boring but that gave me exactly the flexibility I needed. The morning sun felt warm through the truck windows, and I realized I felt lighter than I had in months, like I'd been carrying invisible weight that I could finally set down now that I'd stopped pretending our relationship was something it had never actually been. We unloaded everything into a climate-controlled unit that cost less per month than Whitney typically spent on makeup and skincare products, and I arranged for a furnished short-term apartment in Boulder that would give me time to figure out my next permanent living situation without the pressure of making hasty decisions while emotionally compromised. The drive back to return Carlos's truck took us through the neighborhood where Whitney and I had talked about buying a house someday, back when I still believed she was someone who could commit to building something lasting instead of just enjoying whatever felt exciting in the moment. I felt no nostalgia looking at those houses now, just relief that I hadn't made the mistake of legally binding myself to someone whose version of partnership involved keeping major parts of her life secret from her supposed partner while expecting complete transparency and support in return. Carlos dropped me off at my temporary apartment, a clean one-bedroom place with basic furniture and utilities included, the kind of neutral space that felt like possibility rather than emptiness. As I unpacked my immediate necessities and set up my laptop on the simple wooden desk, I realized this was the first time in 3 years that I could make decisions about my living space without consulting someone else's preferences or accommodating someone else's schedule, and the freedom felt almost overwhelming after months of negotiating every choice with someone who treated compromise like personal defeat and collaboration like an attack on her independence. The first step in rebuilding my life was complete digital separation, which meant blocking Whitney across every platform where we'd been connected for 3 years. I deleted her number from my phone, unfriended her on social media, and removed her from my professional networks with the same systematic approach I'd used to decommission a failed solar installation that was causing more problems than it solved. The process felt surprisingly liberating, like finally admitting that trying to maintain any connection with someone who'd fundamentally deceived me was just setting myself up for more manipulation and drama. Within a week, I'd found a house to rent in Boulder, an hour's drive from Denver but far enough away to ensure I wouldn't accidentally run into Whitney at our old haunts or the coffee shops where she'd probably be telling her version of our breakup to anyone who would listen. The house was a modest craftsman with excellent southern exposure that would be perfect for the solar panel system I was planning to install as both a professional experiment and a way to reduce my environmental footprint. I signed a year lease and arranged for my furniture to be delivered from storage, enjoying the process of setting up a living space that reflected only my preferences and priorities rather than compromises with someone who treated every decision like a negotiation that she needed to win. Through mutual acquaintances, I started hearing fragments of Whitney's narrative about our relationship's end, and the stories revealed exactly the kind of selective editing I'd expected from someone who couldn't accept responsibility for her own choices. According to her version, I'd had some kind of mental breakdown and abandoned our relationship without warning over minor communication issues. She was telling people that I'd been controlling and possessive, unable to handle her professional success and social independence. The irony of someone who'd been cheating for months painting me as the unreasonable partner would have been funny if it wasn't so predictable. She conveniently omitted the part about coming home at dawn dressed for clubbing, the mysterious colleagues who turned out to be nightclub promoters, and the explicit messages I'd accidentally seen from dev_nightlife_ing. Her story made her the victim of an unstable boyfriend rather than someone who'd been maintaining a double life while expecting complete trust and financial support from the person she was betraying. I also learned through the grapevine that her affair with Dev had imploded within days of my departure, apparently because the excitement of sneaking around had been replaced by the boring reality of an available relationship. Dev wasn't interested in actually dating someone who was free to see him whenever she wanted, and Whitney discovered that being someone's secret felt more thrilling than being their actual girlfriend. She'd thrown away 3 years of genuine partnership for a fantasy that evaporated the moment it became real, but I felt no satisfaction in her disappointment, just confirmation that I'd made the right choice in leaving completely rather than trying to salvage something with someone who valued drama over stability. My evening routine in Boulder became a source of genuine contentment rather than the careful negotiation it had become with Whitney. I'd come home from work, cook dinner without having to accommodate someone else's dietary restrictions or schedule, and spend my evenings reading technical journals or working on home improvement projects that Whitney would have dismissed as boring but that I found deeply satisfying. I started taking pottery classes at a local community center, something I'd been interested in for years but had avoided because Whitney thought crafts were pointless hobbies for people who couldn't find real entertainment. The pottery studio became a place of meditation and creativity, where I could work with my hands and create something tangible while processing the emotional aftermath of discovering that someone I'd trusted completely had been living a parallel life. The other students were a mix of retirees, artists, and professionals looking for a creative outlet, and the conversations were refreshingly honest compared to the careful verbal fencing that had characterized my interactions with Whitney toward the end of our relationship. My instructor, Elena, was a patient woman in her 60s who emphasized the importance of accepting imperfections in both clay and life, a lesson that felt particularly relevant as I worked through my feelings about the relationship that had just ended. Working with clay taught me about the difference between things that could be repaired and things that needed to be started over completely, and I realized that my relationship with Whitney had been like a pot with fundamental structural flaws that no amount of patching could fix. The quiet rhythms of Boulder suited me better than Denver's constant activity, and I found myself appreciating the slower pace of a smaller city where I could walk to most of the places I needed to go and where people seemed more interested in outdoor activities and genuine conversation than the networking and social media performance that had dominated Whitney's priorities. I started hiking in the nearby mountains on weekends, something Whitney had always claimed to enjoy but had actually avoided because it interfered with her sleep schedule and didn't provide Instagram-worthy photo opportunities unless someone else was there to take flattering pictures of her against scenic backdrops. The physical challenge of climbing trails and the mental clarity that came from spending time in nature helped me process the betrayal I'd experienced while building confidence in my ability to create a fulfilling life that didn't depend on someone else's approval or participation. The silence of the mountains was healing after months of carefully navigating Whitney's mood swings and unpredictable emotional outbursts that had made our apartment feel like a minefield where any wrong step could trigger an explosion of accusations and drama. My work as a renewable energy consultant became more engaging without the constant distraction of relationship drama and Whitney's demands for attention during my busy periods when I needed to focus on complex calculations and client presentations. I was able to focus completely on complex projects involving solar installations for commercial buildings and wind energy assessments for agricultural operations, work that required sustained concentration and technical expertise that I genuinely enjoyed applying to real-world problems. The satisfaction of helping clients reduce their environmental impact while saving money on energy costs reminded me why I'd chosen this career path and gave me a sense of purpose that had been diminished by months of trying to manage Whitney's emotional volatility alongside demanding professional responsibilities. For the first time in years, I could stay late at the office when a project demanded extra attention without having to negotiate with someone who viewed my professional dedication as a personal slight against her and our relationship. Whitney's attempts to re-establish contact began about 6 weeks after I'd moved to Boulder, starting with what appeared to be a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to make me feel guilty for leaving and responsible for fixing whatever crisis she'd created in my absence. The first messages came through email, supposedly about practical matters like forwarding mail and retrieving items she claimed I'd forgotten, but the subtext was clear manipulation designed to create ongoing contact and opportunities for her to explain why our breakup had been a terrible mistake that we both needed to correct. I responded to legitimate logistical questions with brief, factual answers while ignoring everything else, treating her communications with the same professional courtesy I'd show a difficult client who required clear boundaries to prevent scope creep on a project. When the practical excuses dried up, she progressed to more direct emotional manipulation, sending long emails about how much she missed our relationship and how she'd realized that I was the most important person in her life, carefully avoiding any mention of her affair with Dev or acknowledgement of the deception that had destroyed our trust between us. Her messages painted a picture of someone who'd made minor mistakes in communication rather than someone who'd been living a double life for months, and the selective memory was so blatant it almost impressed me with its audacity. She claimed that our fight had been blown out of proportion and that couples should be able to work through disagreements about social independence without abandoning 3 years of shared history and future plans that we'd built together. The phone call started around the 8-week mark, usually late at night when she'd probably been drinking and feeling sorry for herself, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations depending on her mood and whatever narrative she'd convinced herself to believe that particular evening. I let them all go to voicemail and deleted them without listening completely, because engaging with her emotional roller coaster would only reinforce her belief that persistence would eventually wear down my resistance and convince me to give her another chance to destroy my peace of mind. The messages became increasingly desperate as she realized I wasn't responding to her attempts at reconciliation, with claims that she was having panic attacks and couldn't eat or sleep properly without knowing that we still had a chance to rebuild what we'd lost through her poor choices and my supposed overreaction to reasonable relationship issues. She started borrowing phones from friends to call me when I stopped answering numbers I recognized, a level of manipulation that confirmed I'd made the right choice in cutting off all contact rather than trying to maintain some kind of civilized friendship that would inevitably become a platform for her continued attempts at emotional manipulation and control. The escalation reached its peak when her friend Madison approached me at a coffee shop in Boulder, apparently having driven up from Denver specifically to ambush me with accusations about my cruel treatment of Whitney and demands that I explain my heartless abandonment tactics to someone who'd been nothing but loving and supportive throughout our entire relationship. Madison's version of events painted Whitney as a victim of my controlling behavior and unreasonable expectations, someone who'd been walking on eggshells around my jealousy and possessiveness until she finally found the courage to assert her independence, only to be punished with abandonment when she stood up for herself against my manipulative demands for constant surveillance. The conversation was surreal because Madison seemed genuinely convinced by Whitney's revised history, either because she hadn't heard the full story or because she'd chosen to believe the version that cast her friend as the wronged party rather than the person who'd destroyed a relationship through systematic deception and betrayal. I listened to Madison's passionate speech about Whitney's deteriorating mental health and my moral responsibility to provide closure for someone who'd given me the best years of her life and deserved better treatment than silent abandonment, then calmly explained that Whitney had made her choices with full knowledge of the consequences and that I wasn't responsible for managing her emotional reactions to those choices. When Madison threatened to involve Whitney's family in pressuring me to reconsider my decision and do the right thing by someone who was clearly suffering, I pulled out my phone and showed her screenshots of Whitney's original declaration that she didn't owe me explanations for her behavior, pointing out that I was simply applying her own relationship philosophy universally rather than accepting a double standard where she could demand independence while expecting me to remain available for her. Convenience. Madison left the coffee shop looking confused and frustrated, probably because she'd expected me to either break down with guilt or explode with anger, not respond with calm logic that made Whitney's position look hypocritical and manipulative rather than principled and independent. That evening, I received a series of angry texts from Whitney's phone demanding to know what I'd said to Madison and accusing me of trying to turn her friends against her by spreading malicious lies about their private relationship, as if documenting her own words and actions constituted some kind of character assassination rather than simply letting the facts speak for themselves without editorial commentary. I forwarded those messages to Madison without comment, figuring she deserved to see how Whitney reacted when her manipulation tactics failed, then blocked Whitney's number permanently and changed my own phone number to ensure she couldn't continue the harassment campaign through borrowed devices or new accounts created specifically to circumvent my boundaries. The final attempt came through a mutual acquaintance who claimed Whitney just wanted to apologize properly and gain closure for both of them so they could move forward with their separate lives. But I declined the meeting and explained that closure wasn't something I owed her but something she needed to create for herself by accepting responsibility for her choices and their consequences. The steady escalation of Whitney's attempts to re-establish contact had revealed exactly the kind of manipulative personality I'd been dealing with throughout our relationship, someone who couldn't accept that other people might have boundaries she wasn't entitled to cross or decisions she couldn't override through persistence and emotional manipulation. And seeing that pattern clearly made me grateful I'd trusted my instincts and left completely rather than trying to maintain any kind of ongoing connection with someone who viewed every relationship as a game she needed to win. 18 months after leaving Whitney and our shared life in Denver, I'd established something I'd never had before during our 3 years together, a sense of genuine contentment that didn't depend on managing someone else's emotions or walking carefully around unpredictable mood swings that could turn any ordinary conversation into a battlefield. My house in Boulder had become a reflection of my actual preferences rather than compromises negotiated with someone who treated every decision as an opportunity to assert dominance, and the solar panel installation I'd completed myself provided both practical energy savings and professional satisfaction from applying my expertise to my own living situation. The pottery classes had evolved from therapeutic distraction into genuine artistic pursuit, and I'd progressed from making lopsided bowls to creating pieces that Elena praised for their balance and attention to detail, skills that transferred surprisingly well to other areas of life where patience and precision mattered more than speed or dramatic gestures. My consulting business had grown substantially without the constant interruptions and emotional demands that had characterized my final year with Whitney, allowing me to take on more complex projects and build relationships with clients who valued long-term planning over quick fixes and superficial solutions. I'd started specializing in sustainable energy systems for educational institutions, work that felt meaningful because it combined my technical expertise with environmental impact that would benefit entire communities for decades to come, unlike the relationship energy I'd wasted trying to build something lasting with someone who valued novelty over stability. It was during a consultation at the University of Colorado's Sustainability Office that I met Grace, the veterinary surgeon who would completely redefine my understanding of what partnership actually meant when both people shared compatible values and communication styles. Grace was reviewing energy efficiency proposals for the new animal sciences building, and our initial professional conversation about renewable energy systems evolved naturally into discussions about environmental responsibility, work-life balance, and the satisfaction that came from careers focused on solving real-world problems rather than pursuing status or social media attention. She had this way of asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding complex topics, a stark contrast to Whitney's performative curiosity that had always been more about appearing engaged than actually learning something new. Our first actual date was a hiking trip to one of the trails I'd discovered during my solitary weekend explorations, and Grace's enthusiasm for the physical challenge and natural beauty felt authentic rather than calculated for Instagram photo opportunities or social media validation. She packed her own water and snacks, wore practical hiking boots that showed signs of regular use, and seemed genuinely excited about reaching the summit for the sense of accomplishment rather than the photo opportunities it might provide. We talked about everything during that hike: our childhoods and career choices, our perspectives on relationships and future goals, and I realized I was having the kind of honest conversation that had been impossible with Whitney, who'd always filtered her responses through what she thought I wanted to hear or what would create the most dramatic impact. Grace's approach to life was refreshingly straightforward and grounded in reality rather than fantasy about how relationships should work or what partners owed each other in terms of emotional support and practical cooperation. She was financially independent and emotionally stable, qualities that had seemed impossible to find in the dating world after experiencing Whitney's volatile combination of neediness and entitlement that had made every interaction feel like a negotiation or performance evaluation. Our relationship developed slowly and organically, built on shared interests and mutual respect rather than the intense drama and constant uncertainty that Whitney had mistaken for passion and excitement. Grace appreciated my methodical approach to planning and decision-making, seeing it as reliability rather than boring predictability, and she contributed her own thoughtful perspectives to discussions about everything from weekend activities to long-term career goals. She had her own hobbies and friendships that didn't require my participation or approval, but she also made space for shared activities and experiences that strengthened our connection rather than creating competition for attention or validation. When we decided to become exclusive after 3 months of dating, the conversation was mature and straightforward, based on genuine compatibility and shared vision for the future rather than ultimatums or emotional manipulation designed to force commitment through guilt or fear of abandonment. Grace never demanded explanations for my schedule or questioned my professional dedication, because she understood that meaningful work required focus and commitment that didn't diminish the importance of our relationship but actually enhanced it by creating mutual respect for each other's goals and responsibilities. The contrast with my experience with Whitney became more apparent as Grace and I grew closer, highlighting how much energy I'd wasted trying to build something stable with someone who thrived on instability and viewed every moment of peace as boredom that needed to be disrupted through conflict or drama. Grace's idea of a good evening was cooking dinner together while discussing our respective work challenges, reading in comfortable silence, or planning weekend adventures that we were both excited to experience together. Simple pleasures that Whitney would have dismissed as evidence of premature aging or lack of ambition. 6 months into our relationship, we decided to travel together to visit Grace's family in Oregon, a trip that demonstrated the kind of partnership I'd thought was impossible to achieve with someone who shared my values around planning, communication, and mutual consideration. Grace had coordinated with her family about timing and logistics, discussed expectations and potential challenges with me ahead of time, and approached the visit as an opportunity for me to understand her background rather than a test I needed to pass or performance I needed to give to earn her family's approval. Her parents were warm and welcoming, treating me as Grace's partner rather than interrogating me about my intentions or evaluating my suitability as their daughter's boyfriend, and I realized this was what healthy family dynamics actually looked like when people respected boundaries and communicated directly instead of through manipulation or passive-aggressive testing. The week we spent with Grace's family felt more like home than any time I'd spent with Whitney's relatives, who'd always seemed to be performing their relationships for an invisible audience rather than simply enjoying each other's company and shared experiences. When Grace's father asked about my work with renewable energy systems, his interest was genuine rather than polite, and our conversation led to discussions about sustainability practices on their small farm that gave me insights into agricultural applications I hadn't previously considered. Grace's mother shared stories about Grace's childhood and career development with obvious pride and affection, painting a picture of someone who'd always been thoughtful and determined rather than the careful self-curation that had characterized Whitney's family narratives about her achievements and potential. The trip confirmed what I'd already suspected about Grace's character and values, that she was someone who'd been raised with healthy relationship models and understood that partnership meant cooperation rather than competition, support rather than control, and honest communication rather than strategic manipulation designed to achieve specific outcomes. Flying back to Colorado together, I found myself thinking about the ring I'd been considering for Whitney before discovering her affair, and realizing that what I'd mistaken for love had actually been a combination of habit, physical attraction, and the sunk cost fallacy that had made me reluctant to admit that I was wasting time and energy trying to build something meaningful with someone who fundamentally didn't share my vision of what relationships could be when both people were committed to growth rather than drama. 3 years after the night Whitney had declared she didn't owe me explanations for her social life, I was delivering a keynote presentation at the Rocky Mountain Renewable Energy Conference in Denver when I spotted a familiar face in the audience that made me pause mid-sentence before continuing with my prepared remarks about sustainable infrastructure development in rural communities. Whitney was sitting in the back row, looking significantly different from the confident, polished woman who'd walked out of our shared apartment that final morning, and her presence at a professional conference dedicated to environmental sustainability was so unexpected that I wondered if she was there accidentally or if someone had told her about my speaking engagement. She looked thinner than I remembered, wearing a blazer that seemed expensive but ill-fitting, and her makeup couldn't quite hide the tired expression that suggested she'd been struggling with whatever challenges had filled the 3 years since our relationship ended. During the networking reception after my presentation, several colleagues approached me with questions about the solar installation case studies I'd presented, and I was discussing grid integration challenges with a potential client when Whitney appeared at the edge of our conversation circle, clearly waiting for an opportunity to interrupt. I continued my professional discussion while being aware of her presence, noting that she seemed nervous and uncertain in a way that contrasted sharply with the entitled confidence she'd displayed during our final confrontation about independence and accountability. When the conversation naturally concluded and my colleagues moved on to other networking opportunities, Whitney stepped forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes and looked almost desperate around the edges. She congratulated me on my presentation and mentioned how impressed she'd been with my professional development, speaking as if we were old acquaintances catching up rather than former partners whose relationship had ended in deception and betrayal. I thanked her politely and kept my response brief, treating her with the same courteous distance I'd maintain with any conference attendee who'd approached me about professional matters rather than personal history. She seemed prepared for this reception and quickly moved into what appeared to be a rehearsed speech about how much she'd learned about herself over the past few years and how she'd come to understand that our relationship had ended because she hadn't been mature enough to appreciate what we'd built together or worthy of the stability and commitment I'd offered. The apology sounded genuine but also calculated, as if she'd practiced it multiple times to achieve the right balance of remorse and hope for reconciliation, and I noticed that she still wasn't taking full responsibility for her affair or the deception that had characterized our final months together. According to Whitney's revised narrative, she'd made mistakes due to youth and confusion rather than deliberate choices to pursue excitement at the expense of our relationship, and she claimed that the years since our breakup had taught her to value security and genuine partnership over the superficial attractions that had led her astray. She mentioned that she'd been working a series of temporary marketing positions after being let go from her previous firm due to performance issues, and that the instability had helped her understand why I'd valued planning and consistency over spontaneity and dramatic gestures. Her current living situation was apparently less than ideal, sharing a small apartment with a roommate while trying to rebuild her career and figure out what she actually wanted from life beyond the social media lifestyle she'd been pursuing when we were together. She talked about therapy and personal growth, about learning to appreciate the kind of steady, reliable partnership she'd rejected in favor of exciting but ultimately empty encounters with people who didn't care about her long-term well-being or personal development. The whole presentation felt like an elaborate sales pitch designed to convince me that she'd become the person who deserved a second chance, someone who now understood the value of what she'd thrown away for temporary excitement and validation from people who'd disappeared the moment the novelty wore off. When she finished her speech and looked at me expectantly, I realized she was waiting for me to express forgiveness and interest in exploring whether we could rebuild what we'd lost, possibly interpreting my patient listening as encouragement rather than simple politeness. I looked at this woman who'd once shared my bed and my future plans, who'd known my morning routines and family stories and professional ambitions, and felt nothing except mild concern for someone who seemed to be struggling with the consequences of choices they'd made years earlier. The anger and betrayal I'd felt during our breakup had long since been replaced by indifference and gratitude that her rejection had pushed me toward discovering what healthy partnership actually looked like with someone who shared my values and communication style. I told Whitney that I appreciated her sharing her perspective and that I genuinely hoped she found the happiness and stability she was seeking, but that I was engaged to someone else and had moved on completely from our shared history. The ring Grace wore was visible on my left hand as I gestured during our conversation, and Whitney's eyes focused on it with an expression that combined surprise, disappointment, and what might have been genuine grief for opportunities she'd lost through her own poor judgment. She asked about my fiancé in a voice that tried to sound casual but carried undertones of desperation and comparison, wanting to know how long we'd been together and what made this relationship different from what we'd shared during our 3 years of building toward a future that she'd destroyed. I kept my response general and positive, mentioning that Grace and I had met through work and shared interests in sustainability and outdoor activities, but I didn't provide details that would give Whitney ammunition for the kind of competitive analysis she'd probably conduct later when she was alone with her regrets. The conversation was interrupted when Grace herself appeared beside me, having driven up from Boulder to attend the reception and support my presentation, and the contrast between the two women was immediately apparent in ways that went far beyond physical appearance to encompass confidence, authenticity, and emotional stability. Grace greeted Whitney with polite friendliness when I introduced them, showing no signs of jealousy or insecurity about meeting someone from my past, and her genuine warmth highlighted Whitney's nervous energy and calculated responses. Whitney managed to maintain her composure during a brief exchange about the conference and renewable energy topics, but I could see her evaluating Grace with the kind of competitive assessment that had characterized her approach to other women during our relationship when she'd felt threatened by potential rivals for attention or status. Grace excused herself after a few minutes to speak with other conference attendees about veterinary applications for sustainable energy systems, leaving Whitney and me to conclude our conversation with the awkward awareness that we had nothing left to discuss. Whitney made one final attempt to establish ongoing contact by suggesting we could stay in touch as friends who'd shared important history, but I declined politely and explained that maintaining contact wouldn't be appropriate given my engagement and the way our relationship had ended. She seemed surprised by my firmness, perhaps expecting that seeing her vulnerability and hearing her apology would create some kind of obligation for me to provide reassurance or forgiveness that would make her feel better about the choices she'd made. As Grace and I left the reception together, I realized that Whitney had finally comprehended that I hadn't just left our relationship but had built an entirely new life based on different principles and priorities, and that her belated recognition of what she'd lost couldn't undo the years of growth and happiness I'd found with someone who'd never made me question my worth or manipulate my emotions for her entertainment. The encounter felt like closing a chapter that had already been finished for years, confirmation that moving on completely rather than maintaining any connection with someone who'd fundamentally betrayed my trust had been the right decision for building the kind of future I actually wanted. 6 months after the conference encounter, Grace and I were married in a ceremony that perfectly reflected our shared values and approach to life, surrounded by family and friends who genuinely celebrated our partnership rather than attending out of social obligation or curiosity about relationship drama. The wedding was held at a sustainable event venue in the mountains outside Boulder, with locally sourced catering, wildflower arrangements from Grace's family farm, and solar-powered lighting that demonstrated our commitment to environmental responsibility without being performative about our choices. Grace looked radiant in a simple but elegant dress that she'd chosen because she loved it rather than because it would photograph well for social media, and her happiness was authentic rather than the carefully curated joy I'd witnessed at other weddings where the focus seemed more on the event than the actual commitment being made. Our vows were personal but private, promises about supporting each other's growth, maintaining honest communication, and building a life based on mutual respect rather than romantic fantasies about unconditional love conquering all obstacles through dramatic gestures and emotional intensity. The honeymoon was a hiking trip through national parks in Utah, 2 weeks of shared adventure and conversation that deepened our connection while confirming our compatibility in situations that required cooperation, patience, and mutual support rather than performing relationship happiness for external validation. Settling into married life felt natural and comfortable rather than the dramatic adjustment I'd expected based on cultural narratives about the challenges of merging 2 independent lives into shared partnership. We bought a larger house together in Boulder, one with enough space for both our professional materials and personal interests, including a workshop where I could continue pottery as a creative outlet and a garden where Grace could grow herbs for her holistic veterinary practice. Our first year of marriage was marked by professional growth for both of us, with Grace opening her own veterinary practice while I expanded my consulting business to include residential sustainability assessments that helped families reduce energy costs while supporting environmental responsibility. We found ways to support each other's career development while maintaining the individual interests and friendships that had attracted us to each other originally, a balance that Whitney had never understood because she'd viewed relationships as total merger rather than partnership between independent but compatible people. Occasionally, mutual acquaintances would mention Whitney in passing, usually in the context of her continued struggles with career instability and relationship disappointments, but I felt no satisfaction in her difficulties and no curiosity about the details of her current situation. Through social media glimpses that I encountered accidentally rather than seeking out, I could see that she'd eventually moved to another city and appeared to be rebuilding her life around different priorities, though her posts still carried undertones of searching for external validation rather than authentic contentment. The cryptic quotes about people who gave up too easily suggested she was still processing our relationships and through the lens of victim narrative rather than accepting responsibility for choices that had predictable consequences, but her perspective on our shared history was no longer relevant to my life or emotional well-being. What mattered was the realization that Whitney's demand for unconditional freedom had inadvertently taught me the value of reciprocal commitment and healthy boundaries with someone who shared my vision of partnership as cooperation rather than competition. Grace had shown me what relationships could be when both people approached them with emotional maturity, honest communication, and genuine interest in building something together rather than using each other for validation or entertainment. As I deleted Whitney's contact information from my phone for the final time, symbolically closing that chapter completely, I felt grateful that her toxic relationship philosophy had pushed me toward discovering what genuine partnership actually meant with someone who valued the same things I did. The story ended not with revenge or vindication but with the quiet satisfaction of building a life based on authentic values rather than dramatic gestures, surrounded by people who appreciated sincerity over performance and commitment over excitement. Grace and I were planning to start a family soon, ready to create the kind of stable, loving environment that would allow children to develop confidence and emotional intelligence rather than learning to navigate manipulation and instability as normal relationship dynamics. The future stretched ahead of us filled with possibilities that we were excited to explore together, built on the foundation of trust and communication that Whitney had never understood was the prerequisite for everything else she claimed to want from partnership and commitment.